Welcome back. In this tutorial, we're going to learn about compression. I'll be teaching you what a compressor is, how it works, and how to use a software compressor. The knobs and tools that you see here on this compressor are pretty standard on most software compressors and also on most hardware compressors. We'll also be applying some compression to a song to see how we can improve the quality of the track. Generally, in the home studio, a hardware compressor will be inserted in the signal path between the source and your DAW, i.e. the signal that you record comes in compressed. Usually, the one piece of pricey gear that a home studio musician will make sure he can buy is a good preamp, and often these come with a compressor and a limiter. The combination of the pre and the compressor can give a nice, hot, professional-sounding signal. I use a Millennia preamp compressor for all my vocals and acoustic instruments. However, during the mixing process, a compressor is, of course, still useful, and generally at that point you'll want to apply a software compressor, either a plugin that comes with your music software like this one, or a custom third-party plugin compressor. But the parameters you need to manipulate it are generally the same. So what exactly is a compressor? What's it for? A compressor is one of 4 types of dynamic processors used during mixing. The others are limiters, expanders, and gates, and we will be learning about these other 3 dynamics processors later on in this section of the course. Compression during mixing is a tool that you use to help you balance your tracks so they make the right contribution to your song. One problem in a mix is that too many tracks will contribute too much at the same time. Compression is used on parts with a wide dynamic range to tame transient peaks and leave room for other tracks. So how does it do that? Well, technically, a compressor takes the loudest part of your recording and reduces the volume. Now, why would you want to do this? Generally, you use compression on tracks where there's a lot of fluctuation in volume. Compression gives punch and power to your tracks and a smooth and fuller sound. For example, when you listen to a popular singer's CD, you'll hear that the vocalist sounds just as loud when he's whispering as when he's screaming, and that's because of the compression. In layman's terms, compressors make quiet sounds louder, loud sounds quieter, and thus reduce the volume differences between quiet sounds and loud sounds. Today's pop, rock, and rap music styles compress the heck out of everything. This drives some old-time musicians and engineers nuts. But the style today is for everything to sound loud, even if the emotions are quiet. You don't want to have to crane your neck toward the speakers to make out that passionate or low whisper. You want it to ring right in your ears, just like someone's whispering right into your ear. Most music today is in fact compressed multiple times. Otherwise, it would simply get lost. So it's both an artistic and a technical decision. Your song just can't compete with other professional recorded music if it's not seriously compressed. Relative quietness these days is thought to be no good. It makes music sound kind of wimpy and gutless. That's because our ears are less sensitive to bass and treble frequencies than they are to mid-range frequencies. If the loud parts in your song are 20 decibels louder than the quiet parts, the bass and treble will seem to disappear, and your work will sound tinny and small instead of powerful and present. Jazz music and classical music use much less compression than rock, pop, and hip-hop. Even if you've recorded a signal where the loudest part is 20 decibels louder than the softest part, you can use a compressor to shrink that difference so that, let's say, your whisper is only 5 decibels quieter than when you're really belting. You need to be careful using compression, since if it's overused, it can generate unwanted noise, sound artificial, and create aggravating tone and sounds. It might also drive your input into the red. So how do you know what to compress and by how much? Well, usually you compress the tracks with the widest variation in volume, and those tend to be drums, bass, and vocals. If differences in volume don't add anything musically, you can compress more so that volume is more consistent. Vocals tend to be compressed less than drums since the dynamics are very important to the lead vocal. Let's talk about general compressor parameters, what they are and how they work. They are the threshold, the ratio, knee, gain, attack, and release. The threshold is the value in decibels at which you want the compressor to kick in. If you set it low, then it'll kick in when your work is quieter. If you set it high, like at 5 decibels, then it won't kick in until your recorded input is nearly maxed out. So the lower the threshold, the more of your signal will be affected. A setting of about -10 decibels is typical. Then you tell it by how much to reduce the volume that's above that level by setting a certain ratio. The higher the ratio, the more compressed it'll be. In this way, a compressor tends to reduce dynamic range by reducing the difference between loud and soft. For example, if you set your threshold fairly high at -5 decibels and then set the compression ratio at 2:1, any sound louder than -5 dB will be made 50% quieter. 3:1 means that any time a signal goes above your threshold, the signal above the threshold is reduced 3 times. A ratio of 6:1 means that any time a signal goes above the threshold, it'll be reduced by 6 times. So there's the math. Now let's talk about the third parameter, the knee. This refers to how fast compression reaches the full ratio. A hard knee means it's applied immediately. A soft knee is applied more gradually. You set this value, the knee, in milliseconds. A soft knee is better for vocals unless you have a sudden hard belt or a high note that you might need to pull in a little bit. The gain is what lets you increase the volume prior to compression. You adjust your gain in decibels. Since you're taking away from the overall volume, sometimes you need to add back, so that's what you use the gain for. Some compressors will let you set by how much gain you'd like to reduce the signal during compression. Attack is measured in milliseconds and refers to how long the signal must be above the threshold before compression kicks in. You don't want compression applied immediately on the peaks that have gradual rise, like some vocal swells. You just increase the attack time. If notes are short and fast, like on drums, you can reduce the attack time. Short attack times are more appropriate for rock and pop drums than jazz and classical drums, however. Release is also measured in milliseconds and refers to how long compression will be applied. Your software and hardware compressor may have additional parameters, but these are the basics. You'll need to experiment with your instruments a little bit to figure out which type of compression works best for you. For my vocals, if I happen to be miking pretty close and I'm working on opera, I definitely have to use a pretty high compression ratio for the vocals. But if I'm miking far away, I don't need as high a compression ratio. While you don't want to use a preset unless it really fits your work, you can learn a lot by checking out the parameters settings on the compressor preset. So let's take a look at one of Cubase's built-in compressors. I've pulled up the backing vocals preset. Threshold is -13.9 dB. Ratio is 5:1. That means that when the signal goes above -13.9 decibels, it'll be lowered in volume or compressed 5 times. On the right, we've got a graphic display of what that looks like. So here's the threshold. When the signal reaches this point, compression kicks in. Let's take a look at another preset. For contrast, let's check out lead vocals in your face. Here you see that the threshold is a much lower decibel level. That means much more of the signal is going to be compressed. This allows much more boost in overall volume. The ratio is a bit less, which is normal for a lead vocal to keep dynamics more natural and reduce the likelihood of any artifacts. It allows for a longer attack time, and here is a graphic illustration, a much more gradual compression here. The compression also kicks in lower, and the dynamics aren't squashed as much. I'm going to bring in an instrument preset now. Upright bass, as you see, the threshold is very low, minus 22.9. That's because bass is one of those instruments with a greater difference in volume according to our ears, because we hear mids better than we hear the lows. The compression ratio is lower though, which is also standard to keep the sound more natural and the dynamics intact. The attack time is much longer, allowing for ringing strings. The release is also slower. The graphic display shows us what's going to happen, so as you can see, there's less compression than with the lead vocal in your face. I've got Compressor inserted on my vocal track, my first insert. Let's solo the vocal and have a listen. First, I'll bypass the insert or turn it off. Ce soir, le vent qui frappe à ma porte me parlait des hommes mortes devant le feu qui s'éteint. Let me find a part of the vocal where the contrast between the loud and the soft is greatest. That's where compression is going to make the greatest difference. Des mois d'avril, des rendez-vous, un souvenir, bon air fané, cheveux au vent, baisers volés, rêves mouvants. Que reste-t-il de tout cela? Let's begin. Let's insert a preset on the compressor. Let's take lead vocals in your face. What I'm looking for is a bit more punch for the soft parts, and I want to rein in some of the louder vocal bits. Let me just take a minute to reorganize my workspace a bit so you can see better. Now let's turn on the compressor and have a listen. Un souvenir qui pour moi suit sans cesse. Bon air fané, cheveux au vent, baisers volés, rêves mouvants. Que reste-t-il de tout cela? Dites-le-moi. Okay, stop playback. Let's export that track to compare the waveforms now of the processed and unprocessed signals. Just reorganize my workspace a bit so it's easier to see in this small screen. All the other tracks are muted for the export except for the vocal, which is soloed. The compressor's on. Let's go to File, Export, Audio Mixdown. Let's give the test file a unique name that's easy to identify. I'll call it Vocal with C. The path, I'll accept the Project Audio folder. That keeps everything together. The audio engine output, the sample rate, and bit depth I'll leave as is. I'm going to import to the pool as an audio track and click Export. And Cubase does its job here. Okay, here is our new track. It's stacked next to the first. So even before we have a listen, you can see that the volume of the quiet passage is louder than it was in our original take. The louder section is also a little bit more even. You can see that in the graphics. Let's select a range and take a measurement. Go to Audio, Statistics. So in the original take, my peak amplitude was about -15. Let's check the same range on the compressed vocal. Go back to Audio and Statistics, and here we see that approximately the same passage has a peak amplitude of about -10, which is significantly hotter. Now let's check the louder passage. Uncompressed, the peak amplitude was about -7. Let's close. And let's try the same range on the compressed vocal. And as you see, it's just a little bit hotter at about -6. Pop music engineers compress vocals repeatedly. It's not a good thing to do at this point since I haven't applied any other effects yet. So first I'd need to sort out the reverb and panning and then consider additional compression as a final step, especially for my style of singing. I don't want to generate any unnecessary artifacts in such an early stage of the recording. And this concludes our overview of compression. In our next tutorial, we're going to learn about a specific type of compressor called a limiter.